Hello friends, Amy R here with Prairie Paper and Ink, slowly getting caught up after being unbelievably sick. Anyway, this card is for last week's Color Throwdown Challenge. Didn't get a chance to do any editing, etc. So, I started off by die cutting a bunch of scraps of smooth white cardstock using a few different wafer die sets from Simon Says Stamp. I used the Fiddly Leaf, that's the one at the top there, and Leafy Sprig wafer dies. And I stuck the die cuts to one of my little stick and stamp mats, just hold it in place. And then added color with my Picket Fence paper pouncers and Simon's Positively Saturated inks. And for these two different die cuts, I used Dublin and Sunbeam inks. Once the ink was added, pop those off. And then I've got the die cuts from the Mushroom Stems wafer die set that I'm just obsessed with. I don't know what it is. I don't know. I'm just fixated on these little mushroom wafer dies. I've done a couple videos already using them and loving them. And there will be more videos because I'm just enjoying them. I'm enjoying creating these fun little scenes and different ways to add color to them and all the things. They're just fun. So I put all the pieces, I die cut them twice, and I put all the pieces on the stick and stamp mat. And for the stems and what will be like the underside of the mushroom, I used flannel ink. It also picked up a little bit of like the yellow and the green that was on the stick and stamp mat, and I'm okay with that. That's totally fine. I just did it to add a little bit of color. You know, nothing too crazy. I'm not worried about smooth blend, and of course I'm going to add a bunch of splatter. So I did that for the stems and the undersides, and then the tops of the mushrooms, I'm using pine ink, which is such a gorgeous color. This is one I don't reach for. I know I sound like a broken record, but I also know that not everyone watches all my videos. This is why I do the Color Throwdown Challenge. It so often gets me thinking in color combos I personally just wouldn't do or think of. And it gets me reaching for colors that I don't reach for, normally. And then when I do like this color, I was like, oh, this is a beautiful color. Like, look at it. It's so pretty. But normally I just don't reach for it. Don't ask me why. So I pounced that onto the tops and I was like, this is just yummy. So all my color is added. Everything's good to go. I'm going to assemble all my little mushrooms before adding any splatter or anything. And assembling them, super, super simple. So I've just sped this up. And I purposely did them, crooked, giving them a little bit of a different look. I've done that in a couple other videos, and I got ink smear, like a nice little, it wasn't just an ink smear, it was literally a partial fingerprint of green ink on the one stem. I just used my little mono sand eraser, removed it, we're good to go. I'll link to that. That's the mono sand eraser is just a nice little must-have in one's craft stash, especially if you're like me and you tend to get fingerprints on everything, or it also works for removing excess foil if you're hot foiling and all those things. It's just one of those little tools that everyone should have. So move that ink smear, continue to assemble my little mushrooms, and I just stuck them under acrylic blocks to let the glue dry, and then they're good to go. So once I've got everything assembled, I'm going to stick all these pieces into my splat box, and we are going to splatter everything. I'm going to start with white gouache, my go-to. So I've got just my little palette, and then I'll add a little bit of white gouache to that, and I'll just use my splatter brush, aka my fan brush, that is also covered. I know when I reach for, I have so many fan brushes. I have backups of backups because, things do like to grow legs and disappear. Fan brushes haven't done that yet, probably because I have like 20 of them. But anyway, use my little fan brush with some water, mixed it in with the gouache, and then heavily splattered all of these pieces. One could always stop here. It's fine. But I actually am using a little bit of my Distress Mica Stain. I have mentioned this in other videos. I have all of them. They're beautiful. They're gorgeous. The colors are fabulous. I have them on display behind me in rainbow order, of course. So that's why I don't use them very often, because it's like they're for display only. And then every time I pull them out, I'm like, oh yeah, these are the best. So this is Wicked Elixirs. This was one of the Halloween ones. These are still available. This color is anyway. I'll have links like I always do. The biggest thing to remember with the mica stains is the shimmer settles to the bottom. So you need to mix them up really well before using them, especially if you want to spray them. I had shaken it up before I started filming, and then I shook it up again to really get that, shimmer distributed, and then put some of that on my palette, swirled it around with my fan brush, and added splatter. It's somewhat subtle, but it gives it that pretty shimmer, and the green is just chef's kiss with all of this. It was just meant to be. So, did all my splattering, cleaned everything up, sort of. Oh, if you guys could see my desk, it's just, I have stuff everywhere. Anyway, did all my splattering, let all of that dry. And then for my card base, I was normally going to do, I do white card bases most of the time, but I decided to mix it up a little bit. This is some of Simon's Midnight Green cardstock. This is always really popular, like at Christmas time, because it is that super deep green. Like, it's almost black. It's so dark. I love it. And it was perfect for these cards. So I used my rotary trimmer. I mentioned this in a recent video. This just came out, 3 weeks ago, whatever it was, a month ago. The Tim Holtz rotary trimmer. I've only used it a couple times so far. Still liking it. I just got to get used to it. My only issue with it is I just don't have a spot to put it. But it works great. So anyway, cut the cardstock in half, scored it. So it'll be a top folding 5.5 inch by 4.25 inch card. And then I die cut a couple pieces of white cardstock with one of Simon's stitched rectangle wafer dies. And this piece that's going to go on the front, I decided to use my paper pouncers and that Sunbeam and Dublin inks again. And honestly, after I did all of this, and I'm going to add like water droplets and everything, I wasn't sure. I was like, do I still want to use it? Like, I wasn't feeling it. And sometimes that's okay. Sometimes things just don't work. And if they don't, you can save the piece, die cut it for later. Like, I totally could have done that. I did end up using this. Like, it grew on me like once I let it dry. So I ink blended those two colors just using my pouncers. I wasn't worried about like a perfect blend because once I add everything to it, it's not going to matter. And then I just used my spray bottle, added some water because positively saturated inks are water reactive. And yeah, once it was dry and I kind of laid out the mushrooms and the greenery, I was like, oh, I like it. It's good. So then, same thing. My card base, I was going to leave as is originally, but it was too plain for my taste. So nothing's better than a geometric background. I say this all the time, and it's just truth. Geometric backgrounds are perfect for a bajillion, for everything, really. They work for everything. So this is the quilted background. I put a little bit of tape on the inside of my card to hold it closed. I used my anti-static powder tool on the card front. And then I just put the quilted background face up on my desk, inked it up with clear embossing ink, and then pressed the card base right into the stamp. Then I'm going to coat that with detail white embossing powder. And I do this a lot. I just, more often than not, I'm not showing on videos, usually because my head's in the way and y'all can't see it anyway. But even when using anti-static powder, etc., so often, embossing powder just likes to cling to spots. It's just not supposed to. So all I do is I take just a dry brush and I just brush it off. So that's what I'm doing here because there was a few spots where it was clinging. I don't think it really shows up in the video, but it was obvious. That said, I was getting, again, a little OCD with it and, trying to make it perfect, which 1, perfection, always overrated. 2, some of it's irrelevant. You're not going to see it. And 3, I was already planning on adding more splatter because that's also a nice way to, if things just didn't turn out right, add some splatter, cover it with an embellishment or a die cut. It works. So I removed the excess regardless with that little dry brush. Got my heat tool. I let that heat up a little bit. embossing heat tools do not need to heat up for minutes, ever. Like, a few seconds is all they need. These things get extremely hot. I know sometimes I sound a little ridiculous, but they are a fire hazard. I keep mine unplugged when I'm not using them, and I treat these like with respect, because they get really hot and they just don't need it. And it freaks me out when I hear people like, I was, I ran it for 5 minutes before I started. I was like, oh no, you don't need to. It literally, I let mine run for 10 seconds maybe before I bring it to my cardstock. It doesn't take long. Some tools may be a little bit longer, but this heat tool, and I'll have a link to it, it's like an industrial tool. Anyway, I let it heat up, because if you bring it to your cardstock when it's good and hot, you get less warping, which I'm more concerned with when it's my card base. Hence me letting it warm up for those few seconds, and I got almost no warping, which is wonderful. So once I was done heat embossing the background, everything was smooth and melted. There was no grainy areas. I kept it taped closed because I didn't want to get splatter all over the inside. And then I'm adding white gouache splatter. 1, because it dresses it up a little bit extra, and 2, because you guys know, splatter all the things all over the place. All the cards, all my camera equipment, my desk, ink pads, everything. Even though I'm using my little splat box that I've been using for how many years now, that thing is just coated. Still, gotta have more splatter. So then I am using these, I think that's a reverse friendship is what they're called, sentiment strips for my sentiments. I have them sitting right here. Yes, reverse friendship and some sentiment label wafer dies. So I die cut the sentiments I wanted to use. And for the inside of the card, I have just a stitched rectangle die cut. Again, it depends on my mood. I have no problem having like a dark card base and just leaving it as like adding, I'll still add things to the inside. But with a dark card base, I would just use a gel pen to write to the recipient so it shows up. And sometimes that looks really nice, like a silver gel pen or white or gold or whatever. But other times adding just, a panel of white or lighter cardstock also works and gives it that little extra something. Again, it just depends on my mood. So I added the sentiment, the little stitch rectangle, and one of the mushrooms to the inside. And then to the outside of the card, I built my little scene. So I just kind of tucked the little greenery pieces in and around these little mushrooms. Yeah. And then I would just adhere everything with craft tacky glue, and then I'd stuck my acrylic blocks again just on top. It just holds everything down while I go on to the little next part, etc. And yeah, I didn't add any actual dimension, foam squares. You could totally do that and that would look amazing too. Again, it just depends on my mood. Whether, sometimes it's like all the foam squares and foam dimension, all the things, and like the card ends up being 3 inches thick in the end. But other times I just don't feel the need. I'll just adhere it all and it looks more dimensional than it actually is. So I just adhered everything down with the craft tacky glue, and then just this little sentiment strip. I just used some little thin foam squares just to pop that in place. So once I got those into place, I'm the final little bit, because I've got all these little die cuts, everything going on. I'm gonna add just one little embellishment. These little white clay hearts from this is from a little picket fence pack. I used it on a recent card, and yeah, they were just still sitting here, and I was like, ooh, these little white hearts are perfect for this card. So I just stuck 3 of them on the background. I was going to stick some of the black ones too, but I didn't like how they looked. So I was like, nope. This is good. So I'm going to adhere those into place with little dabs of craft tacky glue, and that's going to finish off this card. Now, I mentioned that this card is part of last week's Color Throwdown Challenge. There's a new one every week. They're completely open-ended. Anyone can play along. And yeah, I'll have a link to it. There'll be a new one coming up this week. And it's all just for fun. And like I said, it just gets me thinking outside the box in terms of color combos, etc. Plus, it's interesting to see other people's take on the same colors. Like, such variety, and that's why I enjoy it. So I'll have a link to that in my blog post. The blog post will be linked directly below the video. I will also have a supply list That will also be directly below the video. So if you're interested in any of the random things I showed making this card, you can just check out the description box below and all that info will be there for you. And as always, thank you all so very much for taking the time to watch my videos, for thumbs upping, for commenting, subscribe if you haven't. I'd very much love to have you. And I will see you all very soon in the next one. Bye.